Welcome to part 5 of Prelude to the Revolution. Now we're going to take a look at the Boston Tea Party. By 1773, all the Townshend taxes had been repealed except for that tax on tea, which leads us to the Tea Act of 1773. One of the things that's often misunderstood is that the Tea Act of 1773 is not a new tax. It's actually just going to have a new way of implementing that Townshend tax on tea that already existed. Okay, this plan was hatched by Prime Minister Lord North, right? What he was trying to do is he's trying to save a company that's about to go out of business, the British East India Company. The British East India Company was about to go bankrupt, and what he decided to do to try and keep that from happening is that he granted them, through the Tea Act of 1773, a monopoly on all shipments of tea to the Americas, right? So it's not a new tax, it's the granting of a monopoly to the British East India Company. Now, at the same time, it has, in this Tea Act of 1773, provisions in it that would prevent the British East India Company from price gouging as well. It sets a limit on the amount that they can charge for the tea, and in fact, the price of tea in the colonies will drop ever so slightly, very insignificantly, right? So for Prime Minister North's point of view, this makes absolute sense. This is brilliant, because here's what's going to happen. We implement this Tea Act, which has a monopoly on tea for the British East India Company, our largest company that's too big to fail. We can't allow it to go bankrupt. It'll cause our entire economy to collapse if we do. Okay, so we will give them that monopoly. The colonists don't grow a lot of tea, and so they drink some tea, and so this is not going to really heavily affect them. The price of tea is not going to change, or if anything, it might go down a little. And the only difference is the British East India Company will be collecting the Townshend tea tax instead of the tax collectors. So again, that gets the tax collectors out of harm's way too. This to him seems to be like a real win-win-win situation. So imagine again their shock when the colonists are outraged by this. Because once again, this is a manipulation of the tax system without their representation. There's a couple of things that the colonists see from their perspective that they see that they find really troubling. First of all, this granting of a monopoly. Sure, today you're granting a monopoly on tea, and we don't grow a lot of tea, and we actually don't drink a lot of tea, so whatever, it's not a big deal. But what happens then if next year you decide to grant a monopoly on something that we do have a heavy investment in, like, I don't know, tobacco farming or shipbuilding, right, to use a northern or a southern industry, right? We've created a pathway to justify this later on. That's number one. Number two, by having the British East India Company collect that tax, you've created a new avenue to implement new taxation. You can have them collect other taxes, and you can implement new taxes, and you can say, hey, look, that's outside the preview of Parliament even. So they see it as a sneaky way to implement new taxes. So of course they're going to have a very severe reaction to it. So severe, in fact, that it's going to lead to British East India Company ships being attacked in Boston Harbor. In December of 1773, the governor of Massachusetts, Thomas Hutchinson, allowed 3 East India Trading Company ships to weigh anchor in Boston Harbor. After that, Sons of Liberty took action against the 3 ships. About 150 of Sons of Liberty, disguised as Native Americans for whatever reason, are going to work for several hours on board the 3 ships, and they're going to open up 342 chests of East India tea and dump them into Boston Harbor. Now, I've had students ask this question before, so I'm going to answer this now. No, it did not turn the harbor into tea. And even if it could, you wouldn't want to drink it. Let's think about this for a second, okay? This is a harbor. It opens into the ocean. This is salt water, okay? Salty tea, no thank you. Plus, where does all the refuge of the city go? It goes into the rivers that flow into the harbor. So it's nasty salt water tea. Pass on that, okay? So they dumped all this tea into the harbor in protest of these 3 ships being there. Now, the Boston Tea Party seems to be really significant, but honestly, when we take a look at it, there's a lot of mythology that surrounds the Boston Tea Party. First of all, there's one myth that says the dispute is over the high tea taxes. Well, that's not true. The tea tax had not changed, right? It wasn't implemented by the Tea Act, right? The Townsend tax was already there, and the tea tax was not really that severe. I mean, most people didn't even notice the amount of the tea tax. It wasn't significant, and most colonists didn't drink a substantial amount of tea anyways. This is not the time period where drinking tea at a certain time every day becomes the British norm even, right? That's a Victorian age thing, right? Another myth is that this dumping of the tea unified the Patriots, right? Well, the word of the event did get out through organizations like the Committee of Correspondence, but most people weren't particularly impressed with this. It's like, well, that seemed kind of wasteful. Ben Franklin, in fact, even went so far as offering the city of, or the British government to pay for the tea, right? It's like, I'll just pay for it so this all settles down, right? The one individual that really was affected by the dumping of this tea was King George III. He was outraged by this. How dare these British subjects vandalize and destroy the property of a British merchant, right? That has the support of the British crown, right? The king is outraged and he's going to take action. He's had it with Boston, right? John Adams really saw the significance of this event. He said, he wrote in a letter, he said, "The die is cast. The people have passed the river and cut away the bridge. Last night, 3 cargoes of tea were emptied into the harbor. This is the grandest event which has ever yet happened since the controversy with Britain opened. The sublimity of it charms me." Right? Now, the last little myth, or an interesting little factoid, is this is not the only incident of dumping of tea. We always remember the Boston Tea Party of December 16, 1773, but we seem to forget the one that took place in March of 1774. A British East India Company ship called the Fortune made harbor in Boston, or made anchor in Boston, Massachusetts, and 60 men, again disguised as Native Americans, I'm not sure why they're doing that, right, boarded the Fortune and dumped 30 more chests of tea into the harbor. So that was, this first one is not the only tea incident.